Welcome everyone to our Mindset Lab interactive workshop. I'm super excited to be able to be a part of this first ever interactive workshop like this. When Dr. Fraser and I started Mindset Lab last year, we wanted to normalize the conversation about our brains and how we can bridge the gap between the research that's being done by people like our two very experienced and wonderful guests today, and people like you, the listeners, and me, who might not know so much about psychology or neuroscience. So much of the time, if we're ever physically hurt or injured, we are taught how to address it, like whether it's a Band-Aid, physio, or rehab. But if we are struggling internally with stress or anxiety, we're often not guided on how we can train our brains to be more self-compassionate. We're not taught how we can work with our brains to practice mindfulness or empathy, especially during a worldwide pandemic where we can be so isolated. These things can be amplified beyond reason, really. So it seems like a good time to be learning some tools to take care of ourselves and the world around us. So let's get into it. If you are familiar with Dr. Jen Fraser and her work, you would know she researches, publishes, and speaks on the impact of bullying and abuse on the brain. Jen has created and participated in various workshops that tackle issues such as emotional abuse, victims of trauma and sexual harassment, neuroscience, and how to activate empathy. Jen's upcoming book, The Bullied Brain, has been reviewed and praised by the father of neuroscience, Michael Merzenich. Merzenich called it the most completely scientifically documented treatment of this subject on planet Earth. He also noted that it's not an easy job to accomplish that in a readable book, which I think speaks to your work, Jen, so well. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We are also joined by the incredible Dr. Leanne Gray, who is a psychologist, educator, author, and national speaker. She is the author of Self-Compassion for Teens, LGBTQ+ Youth, and Educational Trauma. In her private practice, she has served as a forensic, media, and clinical consulting psychologist to public defenders, families, students, and school districts throughout the state of California. Her work has appeared in Fast Company, The Good Men Project, HuffPost, and many more. Dr. Gray was also a TEDx organizer and formerly an instructor of psychology of gender in the departments of psychology and women's studies at UCLA. Dr. Gray founded the Connect Group in 2011 and provided support and funding to the global educational community, as well as professional development seminars in self-compassion. In addition to training thousands of mental health professionals, educators, and doctoral students, Dr. Gray is a subject matter expert for the California Board of Psychology. And finally, an area of Dr. Gray's studies that I would say is an underappreciated part of her work is your work with professional athletes on peak performance and your certification in EMDR, a trauma treatment. Dr. Gray, what a pleasure it is to have you with us today.
Thank you both. Thank you, Jameson. Thank you, Dr. Fraser. Delighted to be with you and in this first interactive workshop.
Yeah, absolutely. I can leave the floor to you two now as we start with self-compassion or wherever you want to go first.
Okay. How about if I begin then by leading us in just a moment of mindfulness? And after that, I'll launch into what self-compassion is. And hopefully Jameson and Dr. Fraser, you can jump in as needed to get me back on track and reorient to some of the topics that are most germane to our audience today. Okay, so let's start by taking a few deep breaths. If you feel comfortable closing your eyes, please do so. Yeah. Nice erect back. Feel your feet where they make contact with the floor, where your body makes contact with the furniture. And continue to take just a few more mindful deep breaths in through your nose, out through your mouth, exhaling all that no longer serves. This is a moment of kindness that we bring to the present, to the here and now, just for ourselves. Anytime you close your eyes, tap into your breath and tune into your heart space. If you like, you can place your left arm there, left hand on your heart. Anytime we tune in, it's an act of self-kindness. As we tune in together, this act of self-kindness also promotes interconnection, shared humanity. In this moment, our hearts beat together. Our breaths come and go together. And these present moments ebb and flow, subsiding just like the waves in the ocean. If any thoughts come to mind, it's okay. That's normal. It's common. Just dismiss them and return here to this present moment of kindness for you, just for you. All right. Whenever you feel comfortable, take one last deep breath, open your eyes, and return to the room. Yeah. So that was a moment of mindfulness. That is a moment of opening one's awareness and attention with balance, with purpose, and yet an openness to whatever comes. Self-compassion rests on some of the things I've just introduced you to. So I'll give the definition of self-compassion, and then we'll quickly jump over to why it's hard to be self-compassionate, kind to ourselves, and how that is so very much needed as we launch back into life after the pandemic. So self-compassion is made up of 4 different components. Number 1 is mindful awareness, that balanced, open awareness that we were just experiencing in that meditation state. Maybe some things flooded your awareness, maybe things left, maybe you became connected with your body. There's a whole host of different experiences people have in meditation. That's why it leads to this open, balanced awareness, this capacity to see things as they are and take them in as they are. Secondly, self-compassion is made up of self-kindness. Simply be your own best friend. That means when you have an oops, an error, a mistake, even a failure, even a big one, time to be kind to yourself more than any other time. Always befriending yourself, always saying to yourself the things that you would want your very best, most magical best friend to ever say to you. And in that way, cultivating an empathic awareness towards yourself that is met with gentleness, with loving acceptance. And then the next component, number 3 in self-compassion, would be this idea of shared humanity and interconnection. So actually, we are all connected. We are all connected by breath. If you're breathing right now, you're alive. That's something we all have in common. So when one person practices self-compassion or mindful awareness, it promotes goodness, not only for the person who practices, but for everyone everywhere. Because we are all interconnected, the things that I do for me that are good benefit you too. And the things that you do for you that are good benefit all of us. And so it becomes really important then to set your mindset about tending to your needs, wants, and desires, not as a selfish or narcissistic act, neither self-indulgent, but rather for the greater good of all. And then it becomes a very important act of kindness that heals you and all those around you. And then finally, the 4th component of self-compassion is the willingness to act to relieve suffering. So some of my predecessors and teachers don't include this 4th bias to action and self-compassion, but I do. And that was primarily because I was trained in compassion cultivation from people at Stanford University's Center for Compassion, Altruism, Research, and Education. And the working definition of compassion over there is the ability to identify suffering and the willingness to act to relieve it. And I felt that any definition of self-compassion would be incomplete unless it also included this bias to action. And so as we move from a life of being sort of lazy and sedentary, locked in, trying to make do with classes and interactions, meetings and events online, to the real world and what it's like to encounter each other, let us remember that we are all coming into this from a place of having been locked in, and that kindness for yourself will translate to kindness for other people. There's so much more I can talk about from there, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to jump in and say anything if you had any.
I just wanted to say that I think that self-compassion at this time in particular, post-pandemic, and we're not even there yet, is so incredibly important because, you know, one of the things that happens is, as we've seen in the behavior of people, when we're threatened and we're threatened by something invisible, which is even more scary, we become very tribal, as they say in empathy research. They use that word because we all of a sudden feel like if we're at risk, resources are at risk. You know, we're seeing phenomenon at the beginning, everybody was rushing out and buying toilet paper. Well, it's because we're so, that's like the height of vulnerability, the thought that, you know, you might not have something like that. And so people in their panicky state, you know, they were trying to protect their own. And so I think we all have a bit of a mountain ahead of us, a bit of a hill to climb in terms of getting out of this very evolutionary tribal mindset and opening our hearts back up to, you know, even though we might not really feel like helping others, because we feel a lot at risk, our brains feel threatened. That's one of our lowest points when our self-compassion can evaporate. And so coming out of the pandemic, I think like the work of, the kind of work that Leanne does and the knowledge that she has is incredibly valuable. Like we can't hear that lesson enough. So I just wanted to acknowledge that aspect of it.
We do actually have one question as well from our Google form, and that was, what is the line between setting of boundaries and compassion?
What is the line between setting boundaries and self-compassion? Well, in my book on self-compassion, I talk about boundary setting being a key component of recovering from trauma, and therefore setting boundaries with toxic relationship environments, foods, events, etc., chemicals, is an act of kindness to oneself. So setting boundaries would be an act of self-compassion, in my view. So Jen, thank you so much for your kind words before. I was thinking about what you were saying in terms of how the pandemic is a threat to everybody. It's an existential trauma. It's a large scale trauma that's going to continue to affect humanity for generations to come. And you mentioned the ways in which this large scale threat activates certain programs, habits in humanity around protection, security, and survival, for example. And so the threat that COVID has placed on humanity should promote things like freezing, fawning, fleeing, and fighting, the different reactions to trauma, right? But really what we're seeing is more tribal affiliation than ever before, especially in the United States, lots of division. And so when you wonder about how we can be kind and self-compassionate and compassionate to other people post-pandemic, when we're sort of ensconced in these tribal affiliations, the idea is to remember that all of humanity is interconnected by the breath, for example. Mm-hmm. We get beyond the threat and we get beyond the differences and the divisions, the in-group and the out-group, by remembering that we are all human beings. We all have blood that runs through our veins. That's not to say that there aren't any differences among us. One of the topics that we're supposed to be covering today is on intersectionality. So maybe this is an okay time for me to talk on that. So, and I'll bring it to athletes as well after I bring up what I'm intending to at this moment. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. She's an American civil liberties activist, attorney, author, and professor. And she expressed how the different social, biological, and cultural identities that a person has, the more that they have intersecting within them, the more likely and prone they are to discrimination, harassment, abuse, marginalization, etc. So while we may all have blood running through our veins. We may all be breathing. There are also, of course, differences, and those differences do need to be respected because not everybody experiences life in the same way. And so the different identities that a person has will be like lenses that color and influence the way that they see the very same world and reality that we three see. So for example, our athletes that identify as LGBTQ experience their lives through a very different lens than their cisgender heterosexual peers do. While it's important to remember that we are all coming back to life after the pandemic with maybe a renewed sense of heal and joy for our LGBTQ plus athletes, the time in lockdown could have contributed to a rise in things like anxiety, depression, substance abuse, self-harm, and suicidality, all of which we know are very high already in the LGBTQ population, more so among our youth, and even more so at times among our athletes because of the level of performance pressure that is placed upon them. So there are differences, but all of these differences remind us that the common denominator is that we are human, our lives are fragile, we're only here for a small amount of time, and that these different intersectional identities actually remind us also of how we are vulnerable. And that is where we can find kindness and tenderness for ourselves and each other.
I think that relates very well. Sorry, Jen, I'm just going to bring up a question here that was brought in the chat to Dr. Gray, kind of regarding self-compassion, not necessarily intersectionality, if you don't mind me just bringing it back for 1 second here. But one person asked, are you able to further touch upon the fourth component that you mentioned a little bit earlier, and what constitutes the act of relieving suffering when dealing with others?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. So to elaborate more on that fourth component, so compassion and self-compassion tend to be most powerful and potent when people are suffering. And suffering could be like under pressure, having stress, having performance anxiety, being apprehensive about something, being reluctant about something, having to cope with a failure, for example. So suffering can take many different shapes and forms. The bias to action that I'm talking about, the willingness to act really suffering, can take any number of forms. If, for example, it could be taking a drink when thirsty. It can be having a meal when hungry, taking a rest when tired, right? Going and seeking mental health therapy when symptoms are excessive, finding other people to connect with when lonely. So those are just some mild ways in which one can act in a self-compassionate kind way to relieve their own suffering. In a more moderate but not too severe way, seeking out a doctor's treatment when one is sick is an act of self-compassion, and it falls under number 4, that willingness to act to relieve suffering. So as you see, there are many examples of this that can apply in different situations.
Thank you.
Maybe I could just build on that question and ask if you could talk a little bit about it's something that I hear come up a lot in my work is negative self-talk. Would you say that that's part of the level 4, the idea that you're very consciously changing how you speak to yourself and therefore others? Is that action per se?
Yes, precisely. And that action is also an act of self-kindness, number 2, because being your own best friend means you would never speak nasty like that to your best friend. So how dare you speak that way to my friend?
Yeah, I know. It's really quite amazing how we do it. I would never in a million years say to a friend or one of my kids, you're such an idiot. Never. I've never said those words in my life, even though I've thought them at times, especially with my parents, for example, or siblings. But I say it to myself all the time. I do any little thing wrong, I'm quick to say that in my head. So I find it really fascinating. Maybe if there aren't other questions, Jameson, maybe we could have Leanne talk a little bit more about what are the things that thwart? Like, why do we have to be taught self-compassion? How come it's so hard for us to be kind to ourselves when we would more readily offer it to another?
So the research does suggest that it's much easier to be nice to someone else than it is to ourselves. And I think it's associated with some of the literature around narcissism, and also a deflection somewhere between the 1980s and the early 2000s, where there was a deflection away from the self and a refocus on other, on the good for all, on the group, on society. And so as a culture, North America has moved away from valuing the self and have actually pathologized it in the popular media, to the extent where any type of self-care is now seen as something super radical or very selfish. And in fact, it's not. It's really quite like putting the oxygen mask on yourself in an airplane when the cabin depressurizes, so that you can then be available to other people, instead of saying, no, I'm not going to put the mask on myself first. Let me help everybody in the airplane first, because I'm so selfless. Like, we know this doesn't make sense, but for some reason, the culture has trained us to move away from being kind to ourselves, nurturing even needs, wants, and desires, basic needs. And so sometimes practicing self-compassion can actually be like seen as a weakness because it's tending to oneself. It can also be, it can result in difficulty, irritability, and anger, which would make people step away from it again. So there are a bunch of barriers to self-compassion, both socially and within the individual, that need to be overcome first before a person can even approach self-compassion. And thank goodness now we have some nice evidence base, a good 10 or 20 years worth, to show that these types of practices are effective in reducing depression, reducing anxiety, increasing well-being, increasing peace and joy, and a sense of efficacy and agency in the world. So so wherever there might be doubt, resistance, or barriers, either from the individual or the culture, we have data to show us where that is actually an irrational concept.
Mm-hmm.
I like that analogy so much of the oxygen coming down. I've actually never thought about it like that, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So for our athletes, one way that athletes can take care of themselves and nurture themselves with self-compassion is to not have that negative self-talk, Jen, that you were mentioning earlier. To really shut that stuff down right away, and to know that it isn't a driver towards excellence and achievement, but rather it is a knife that hurts the soul and keeps a person from meeting their potential. And so the converse needs to replace that negative self-talk with positive self-talk. A reminder that past performance is the best predictor of future performance. A reminder that even failures can be overcome. I found it noteworthy that while recovering from 2 broken legs, Tiger Woods is looking forward to getting back on tour. I'm thinking I'd be looking forward to walking, but there's something about turning failure into a comeback for an athlete. And that's just something that one can remember, that even in moments of failure, there can be amazing growth that comes out of it, supersedes whatever existed prior.
Yeah, I would love to add to that, taking it full circle back to our beginning with you walking us through a mindful moment. I think that George Mumford expresses this really well when he speaks to athletes, and he says to them that it's incredibly important that you use mindfulness and that you learn to listen to the still, small voice inside, the voice of knowing. And I think, especially in our world now, with technology being what it is, we're pretty bombarded with everybody else's voice. We are tuned into the media's voice. We're tuned into the voice of social media and everybody else and all of the different communities that are around us. And we don't listen enough to ourselves. And he really, with his athletes who achieved at the very top level of professional athleticism and championship winning, he taught them that really their best friend, their truest friend, their most helpful friend for performance was inside. And they had to learn to tune into that mindful place and listen to that voice, because that is what leads you to fulfill your potential, as you say. And for athletes who are constantly spoken to about how to improve, really there's just an incredible, miraculous self within, brain within, and heart and soul and mind to take you where you want to go, as we all know. And Tiger Woods would be an example of that type of maybe inner knowledge taught to him at a very early age. And I don't want to say that it was necessarily positive for him. I know there's many layers to how he was trained, but still, that level of performance comes with a very strong mindfulness and mindset.
Right. And the full circle that you're talking about is also, how do we discern or discriminate between inner negative self-talk and that still silent voice? And so someone who's new to mindfulness, new to tuning into the breath, might wonder if that inner negative talk is the still voice telling them they're bad. But the discrimination and the discernment comes in actually quieting the chitter chatter that's very judgmental, and finding an inner conviction and an inner knowing. And I think that's what you might be tapping into with Tiger Woods, is at a very young age. Perhaps he and or his parents knew something about his potential and greatness. And so there was some type of mirroring or acknowledgement either within himself or within parents towards him that allowed him to develop that conviction, that knowing. And so this conviction and knowing, it doesn't have as many words as the negative self chatter. That has a lot of words and a lot of stories and a lot of energy. But intuition, that infinite sense of power, potential, and knowing, it comes very quietly with very few words in moments when one might not expect it. Very different type of communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, it makes me think of visualization as well. It oftentimes can come in the, like dreams do, it comes in the form of much maybe deeper, imagining yourself or seeing yourself, even from different perspectives as well, can be incredibly much more archetypal and healthy and true to, like you say, intuition, a deeper knowing.
Right. Well, there's even something at the neuroscience level that what we think about, we bring about. So the more you visualize something, the more you think about something, the more the patterns and habits are formed. And the more those neurons fire together, they wire together, creating muscle memory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something extremely powerful about the spiritual and neuroscientific level when thinking about visualization. And visualization is something that one can tap into as an act of self-kindness and just a practice of mindful awareness. And it always amazes me and impresses me at the level of detail that some athletes can experience with their visualization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of reminding me of one of the things that Dr. Helen Reese touched on was like actually empathy being kind of the means to learning more about others and more about yourself. Are you able to maybe talk about, either one of you talk about like that bridge between self-compassion and empathy?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in at this point with, well, we were planning to do actually a bit of an empathy demonstration. Maybe, do you think maybe we'll just talk generally a little bit about empathy and then go through I'll show you something with Leanne, kind of a demonstration of a useful tool, a way that you can take the knowledge and actually just, put it into action. But empathy, what's been really interesting in the research in sort of the last 10 years or so, it goes back to the 90s, but in the last sort of 10, 15, there's been really interesting work done using technology. So Dr. Tanya Singer, for example, she did this sort of interesting thing. I love stuff like this because I love moments of innovation where somebody thinks a little bit outside the box and says, And so normally what people would do, neuroscientists would do, or psychologists and psychiatrists, is they would look at the person's brain that they were trying to figure out under a MRI or fMRI. So MRI is taking a picture of the brain, fMRI is it's more like a video of the brain. It's the brain in real time doing things. And so what Tanya Singer did that was different was, instead of just looking at the brain and how it was reacting, she put two fMRI machines happening, and she looked at the one brain of a person suffering. So the way they had the person suffering was they were taking their hand and they were pricking their fingers with pins. So it's painful, just stinging pain. And in the other scanner, the other fMRI, they put an observer, and they would show the observer videos of someone getting their fingers pricked and hurt. And in the initial studies, it was someone that they knew. So someone that they actually cared about, but it's also confirmed with people that you don't know. Just like, we can go and watch a movie. We don't know these people, and we actually have, suspension of disbelief. We know they're not real, and we will find ourselves crying in a film. That's empathy. And so what's happening in the two scanners that really interested the neuroscientists was they could see on the one brain, sure, the insular cortex is lighting up. That's the pain system, and the brain is in pain, and it's communicating to the person, hey, get yourself out of this situation, avoid pins in the future. Pins hurt, they're dangerous, not good for you. But the empathy brain was lighting up because, just as Leanne talked about, the key thing about humanity and where health and well-being lie is an understanding that we are so profoundly interconnected. Our brains are absolutely wired to care about somebody in pain. They're wired that way. And it's a survival. It's where reciprocity comes from. It's where collaboration comes from. Human beings don't have big teeth or furry hides or sharp claws. We depend on being together, supporting each other, and using our brain, basically. It's the way in which we've survived all this time and flourished. So what they said to themselves, well, why is it that the pain shows up in the brain of the watcher? The observer, their brain lights up just as if they were in pain themselves, but to a lesser degree. And what they realized is that's exactly the action piece that Leanne's talking about. That's the brain getting activated. It's like, you're not in enough pain. You don't need an oxygen mask yourself right now. You're not in trouble, but that guy is, and you should go help them. That's what the brain is telling them. You know what it feels like. You are watching someone suffering, and that's awful. And you're getting activated to go and do something about it. And that's that next critical step. Now, as we all know, this is complex. There's moments where the person in the fMRI is watching the other person, their brain is lighting up in the same pain centers, not to the same degree, but lighting up, but they don't act. And that's where we can have many more conversations around, just as Leanne was talking about, what blocks someone, what's their history, what's their training, what does culture say? What are all the different barricades we have to what would appear to be a very natural impulse built right into ourselves? So just one final thing about empathy that I think is really interesting is that we have a tendency in our culture to think that we are naturally born bullies. Children are just these shocking bullies, and adults have got to constantly tell them to stop doing this bullying behavior. We have zero tolerance for it, we say as adults. Well, the irony is none of that's true. Children are not born naturally. The vast majority, 99.9% of children are born wired for empathy, which means that 40 minutes after the moment they are born, they will start imitating the adults in the room. So if the doctor looks at the baby and sticks out her tongue, the baby will start to try and imitate that behavior. And you say to yourself, well, why is that? That's how babies survive. They are utterly dependent on the powerful people in their world for years and years and years. If they don't know how to read their feelings, the powerful people, their thoughts or their intentions, babies don't have a chance. They need to know, and they need to be able to quickly learn how to be a part of that big, powerful person's world. So they're wired for empathy. So really our big question should be in society, how is it possible that these children born wired for empathy end up so oftentimes in bullying behaviors? Who teaches them? Because it's learned behavior. That's from culture. So that's kind of a broad overview of empathy. I'm sure people have questions, would love to talk more about it, or when people are ready and Leanne's ready, maybe we can just go into showing you something about it.
We do have one question about visualization. So maybe we can, if you want to address that now, or we can hold off till after the empathy exercise. Go through it.
I say we jump in and do visualization.
Okay. The question is, the comment is picking up on the comments about visualization. It seems like what the pandemic has really taught us is that the future is completely out of our control. We make plans as the God laughs. I wonder what the implications of this are in terms of visualization, which really gestures towards some kinds of defined future. Can visualization withstand the pandemic? Question mark.
Can visualization withstand the pandemic? Absolutely, yes. And I have a caveat to that. So, yes, we have learned that we do not have power and control over our futures. And the pandemic has shown us that more than ever before. But on the other hand, we never did. So the idea about visualization is to encode the memory, the mind, the body, the soul, the emotional body, all the different layers of being human, to encode it with the plan, to prepare it. And then we let go. We surrender. And it's in the surrender and the letting go that the magic happens. And so we can have visualizations, we can have hopes and dreams and goals, pandemic aside, and then we allow it to unfold in the timing that it needs to unfold, which is probably not your timing, never is my timing. But there's something about letting things unfold in their own time and allowing things to, let's say, incubate for as long as they need to be. So sometimes visualizations need to continue with tenacity and persistence and consistency during the pandemic, so that once we emerge out of this pandemic era, those visualizations can convert quickly, easily, and gracefully into taking action.
Yeah, I noticed that time to kind of let things, as you say, incubate isn't really something that is like standardized or ever really like accepted. I find it's like almost like expecting results very quickly, which I understand is kind of how our society works, in my opinion. Just a comment.
A really great analogy for that, Jameson, I find, is the idea of nature's fallow field. So if you're a farmer and if you just constantly plant a field over and over and over again and expect it to perform every single time, it drains it. It loses nourishment and health in the soil. So what do farmers do? They leave the field fallow. They surrender it. They let it do nothing. They let it just replenish, essentially. And if we learn to do that more in our lives, I think it would be easier on us. And athletes in particular, all of us are performers. We're performing at work, we're performing in our families, we perform with our friend groups, but athletes on top of that are very publicly performing their sport. So the expectations on them and the pressures on them are greater. And they therefore need to find, again, that space for the fallow field, for incubating, or visualizing without expecting that according to a tight timeline, they're going to be able to perform it. And there's health in that for sure.
Yeah, Jameson, I think you're talking about the incubation, the visualization, the pre-work period. And Jen, I think you're talking about the rest period of after work. And they're both important periods for promoting productivity, activity, action, and performance achievement, excellence, etc. I think the difference, however, lies on the pre-performance, pre-action side, where visualization and incubation come together with procrastination, for example. And so, Jameson, where you were talking about how there's this expectation that things happen instantaneously, I think that comes out of our highly technology-driven society. We become used to instant messaging. We become used to instant mail. We don't have to wait for faxes anymore. We're used to now making orders at a drive-through and the food pops out instantly. So the level of instantaneity that we have in our culture right now is really quite radical. And so that instantaneousness is being superimposed on human beings with the expectation that we operate with the same standardization, efficiency, and immediacy as email and drive-throughs, for example, but we're not anything like that at all. And so I like to tell students, and I'm not sure, maybe this is related to athletes, maybe not so much, but students struggle a lot with procrastination, as do other professionals in the creative arts, for example. And procrastination tends to be associated with what I call like a downloading phase, a pre-work phase, where the information is coming together and the person cannot be expected to sit down and just do it. There needs to be this space where the information is taken in. The purpose of the project, assignment, whatever it is, needs to be taken in, integrated, worked with, synthesized. And then at some point later on, they can then produce it. And it is not usually on the timeline of, say, email instant messages, text messages, or drive-throughs. So we can leave land fallow, we can leave people to rest afterwards, to recharge and to recover, so they can re-enter this period of incubation, this period of pre-work, pre-performance, where all the practice gets integrated, synthesized, so that it can come out at a higher level.
Yeah, I think, to my mind, and it's interesting you'd say that too, because that's supposedly a very strong characteristic of very creative people. They look like the fallow field, they look like the procrastinator, but actually lots is going on. You just don't see it. It's not manifesting, but it's on the deeper level. There's a ton going on. There's I can't remember who gives it, but there's a funny TED talk. It's not funny, but it's a TED talk about creativity, where the speaker, the kind of funny part of it is he doesn't invest in this technology or patent or scientific something or other, because these guys don't seem like they're getting any work done. They're not hitting their deadlines, and they can't show anything. And it ends up being some, it's like Tesla or something. And he didn't invest because they didn't look like they were working hard enough or meeting, the very rational, logical, instantaneous deadline. So yeah, I think it's a key part of especially the creative athlete,
Prodigies definitely do perform on different timelines, right?
Yeah, I love that idea of all those times that I've just been so frustrated with my own procrastination. I'm just going to rethink it now and just be like, yeah, I'm synthesizing. I am
getting ready to work.
Yeah, I'm in the pre-work phase, totally.
Pre-work phase.
Yeah.
It can last a really long time, kind of like growing a baby. It looks like not much is happening, but lots under this, like you said. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a particularly fun demonstration for me, because I first met Leanne because the company I was working for hired her to teach me empathy facilitation or empathic listening. And so I went through these amazing classes with her where she taught me how to do this. And I learned a ton about it, which I'll tell you after, what I learned about myself and myself as a listener and myself as an empathic person. But what I'm going to do is just walk you through just a very short version of how it works so that you can see it first, and then we'll talk about it after. So the first thing that we would do in an empathic facilitation was set the intention. So we would sort of open ourselves up. We would say, our intention is compassion. It's self-compassion. It's compassion for one another. It's compassion for the world. Our interconnectedness, here we are going to empathically listen to one another. And then the idea would be that there would be one speaker. And so right now, this is going to be Leanne. Leanne's going to speak, and I'm going to listen. But the key part of my listening is I'm not listening in order to be able to respond. And that's how we usually listen to one another. So while the person is speaking, we tend to think about how we might defend ourselves, or we think about a funny thing that will make them feel better, or we think about how much we know what they're saying because it's happened to us too. Or we think more dark things like they're wrong and I'm going to teach them a lesson, or whatever it is that we think. We aren't really listening. We're not listening closely, and we're not hearing them. So what I'm going to do is show you a different way. I'm going to show you what it is to listen with just pure empathy, because when Leanne speaks, I'm setting myself, my own intention, the intention within compassion. My own intention is just to be able to repeat back to her as accurately and as closely as possible what she's told me. Okay, so we're just going to do that first. And at the end of her speaking, she will say, I feel heard. And then what you normally do is you reverse, but we're not going to reverse because we don't have time today. We're going to talk about what the implications of this type of listening does for all of us, essentially, if we practice it. Okay, so Leanne, please, we would love to hear you talk about the work that you've done with high performance athletes and what you learned from them and what you felt they needed to know.
So my early years as a psychologist in private practice, were met with a demand in my community for trainings around gifted youth. And that became my specialty only because of this demand for services for gifted youth. So I would do some professional development seminars. I was treating gifted youth, assessing them. And it was a very interesting field because gifted youth can have gifts in a wide range of areas, from the arts, including music, to sports or other areas.
So in your early career, you began working as a psychologist, and you found that there was a demand in your area for people who could work with gifted children in particular. So you ended up actually specializing in this field because there was such a huge demand. And the kinds of giftedness that children displayed was in different fields like arts and in sports and in other areas. And so that you found yourself treating them as well as assessing them.
Right. And it really moved from children to adults very quickly, in that I wasn't only working with children in the schools, but I was treating adults in my private practice as well. And the adults that would come into my practice that didn't know they were gifted were professional athletes, ironically. And so they would come into my practice and discover that the reason why they are professional athletes is an extension of their giftedness.
So what I'm hearing you say is that quickly in this field that you had ended up sort of being pulled into because of the demand, you were not just working with children in schools, you found yourself also working in private practice with adults. And the adults that were coming to you, ironically enough, were professional athletes. And what was the irony being that these professional athletes did not know that they were gifted, and they didn't know that the reason they became professional athletes was directly linked to their giftedness.
Right, right. Around the same time, I also became aware of the role of trauma in a person's development, and also how incredibly pervasive and prevalent it is.
What I'm hearing you say is that you discovered at this same time the role of trauma, and that trauma was impacting your clients, and that you were also becoming very aware of its pervasiveness.
So there are two kinds of trauma: little t trauma and big T trauma. Big T trauma are things like assault and natural disasters, kidnapping, things that people generally recognize as traumatic. Small T traumas are slight humiliations, failures, embarrassments, etc., that are very minor on a scale of things, but they leave a like a psychospiritual scar on the person's soul, mind, heart, being. It becomes a learning opportunity. And so these little t traumas became very much relevant to the performance of my athletes. And so even though we weren't working on trauma, or in fact, we had to do some backup work on giftedness, some of the things that I was learning about trauma and how to treat it became very important for my professional athlete patients.
So as you were working with these professional athletes, you started to differentiate between big T trauma and small t trauma. And big T trauma would be something like an assault or a kidnapping or a natural disaster, things that we all recognize as being traumatic. But much more prevalent and actually impacting these professional athletes was small t trauma. And small t trauma don't get as recognized. And they're things like, they can be as small as an embarrassment or a failure or a mistake or these types of things, but the accumulated impact of them was holding back these athletes or negatively impacting their performance. So while you were backtracking into giftedness, you were also really understanding the value of paying some attention and working on these small t traumas as well.
Right. So on the one hand, the athletes that I was working with needed to understand that being in the top 5% of their sport meant that they were likely quite gifted. But I also had to help them recover from the series of small T traumas that would arise when they wouldn't place at a tournament, or when they would have a poor showing, for example. So these are the different things that we would have to work on. And so I would use EMDR, peak performance protocols, to help the athletes desensitize the small traumas along their career so that they could elevate their performance.
So what I'm hearing you say is that these people, although they're in the 5% and therefore highly gifted, at the same time, being in that percentage as a professional athlete means you have a lot of small T traumas that that you have to pay attention to, that are impacting you, and they need to be addressed because they hang on, I've just lost this. I know, don't tell me. I lost the string. That's so interesting. Okay, wait, let me go back. So what they needed to learn was that these small T traumas also had to be addressed, because as an elite athlete, as a gifted athlete and a gifted individual, they weren't actually very well set to handle setbacks. That was actually hard for them. If they had a poor showing, because when you're in this top 5%, you always are expected to be at the top of your game, that expression. So a poor showing, or if they didn't make the cut, or something like that went wrong, small trauma, you needed to teach them using things like EMDR, how to desensitize their reactions, because their reactions were too strong to these smaller events.
It's not really a teaching. EMDR, I like to call it like a surgical skill. And so when I use EMDR, it's like pulling out my scalpel. And so the desensitizing is like a neutralizing of these memories that were previously tied to some negative cognition, like I'm a failure, I'm bad, I can't perform, for example. So it's not that I would teach a person, it was literally, I would do something with them in order to neutralize the impact of negative memories. And in so doing, it would raise their performance.
So the EMDR is not teaching. It's actually much more like a surgical intervention, where you are very targeting a negative memory. You're removing it in a sense. You are desensitizing it to neutralize it, so that the person, especially since they have this negative reaction that's coming from accumulation, it's interfering with their performance. And when you were able to use EMDR in this way, you were able to enhance their performance.
Right. EMDR is an acronym that stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And we don't really go by the full name anymore, because there are many different ways of creating bilateral stimulation, not just moving eyes back and forth, but there are other modalities as well. What we know from neuroscience research is that these different types of bilateral stimulation, whether it sounds to the ears, visual stimulation, or tactile stimulation, it stimulates both the left and right hemisphere of the brain and creates natural healing process to neutralize or desensitize these negative memories.
So EMDR is an acronym, but it's not used anymore, because it's no longer just about eye movement. It's also, you can use different modalities such as hearing, both ears, or touch, tactile sensations, or the eyes, lateral back and forth. And from a neuroscience perspective, what's happening is these different approaches can be used because it's impacting left and right hemisphere of the brain and how they communicate with each other. And thereby this has been shown to have a healing impact on the brain, so that, once again, it has to do with neutralizing the negative and enhancing performance.
And back to our athletes, I used these EMDR peak performance protocols with the athletes in their place of sport. So I would go with them and do the EMDR with them, and then they would perform, and then I would do it again, and they would perform, and I would do it again. And so the act of utilizing EMDR for peak performance with professional athletes is a well-established practice for improving athletic performance?
So when you were working with the professional athletes, you would actually go with them to their site, wherever it is that they do their sport. You go to the field or whatever, where the gym, wherever they're performing, and you would actually practice in the moment. So you would do EMDR, because it has to do with peak performance. It goes together. So they would perform their sport, and then again after, you would do EMDR, and this would be a repeated practice. And this is now a well-established approach to working with elite athletes, professional athletes, and allowing them to constantly erase those negatives so that they can have peak performance.
And with that, I feel heard. Thank you.
That was so interesting. That was so interesting. Okay, so I'm dying to tell everybody. First of all, let's just pause for, I want to talk so badly, it's embarrassing. Because it's really hard work to repeat back to someone else and not be allowed to say anything. Oh my God, especially when you're immature like me. No, but let's open up for questions first.
As far as the smaller traumas go, were these people being affected by an accumulation of the same type of trauma repeatedly, or was it the suffering of different kinds of small traumas, or both?
Both. In both cases, like a person can experience an accumulation of small t traumas, whether same or different, and they can metastasize into much bigger problems. We know with our trans friends that being misgendered is a small t trauma, but when it happens several times a day related to identity and existence, it accumulates into a big T trauma very quickly.
Wow, okay. Great. It seems like that's the one question we have.
I just wanted to say, when you were talking about big T and small t, I think a really good analogy for this is concussions, and remembering like what concussions do to the brain. So we have a tendency to think that if you get knocked out and you're unconscious, you've had a really terrible concussion. And we now know that it's incredibly serious and you need to treat it with all the proper medical protocols, or you could do serious brain damage. What we aren't as aware of is that there's lots of small t concussions, traumas that happen to the brain, even from putting the weight of a football helmet on a 10-year-old's neck that does not have the strength to hold that amount of weight. Just putting the helmet on is not good for the brain. And the research on this is fascinating, but even getting bonked and you don't pass out, that can still be really dangerous and hard on the brain. So that's a great way to remember small t, big T. One other thing I want to interject into that discussion, actually, because it's really important in my work, is from a bullying and abuse point of view. Leanne, I'm thinking about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And what was really interesting to me in that research was they didn't ask any questions about natural disaster or immigration or war or any of those things. They didn't even deal with those traumas. What they were looking at is, what is the impact of trauma from adult to child? And I just think it's not talked about enough. It's a very uncomfortable conversation, obviously, and a lot of people just don't want to go there. It's triggering for lots of us. But the reality is, adult to child trauma is a big T trauma, and it can wreak havoc with the brain. And the brain, let me just add quickly, is incredibly adept at healing. It can heal. It's a miracle healer, in fact. So it's not cause for total distress and despair, because just as our bodies are pretty miraculous at healing, so are our brains. But okay, so what I wanted to say about that empathy demonstration that we gave you, I promise you that if you practice it, you'll probably have some of the feelings that I had. So you saw me lose my concentration at one point. The reason I started to lose my concentration at that point was because I was literally getting tired. The concentration required to listen to someone else and repeat back what they're saying is not to be underestimated. It's exhausting. So, and it goes to show you how much we don't do it again, or I don't do it in my life nearly enough. So that's one thing. I started to lose my train of thought because my brain was like starting to just think of things I wanted to say rather than staying the course and really, really capturing every word of what Leanne was saying. I was trying my hardest. So that was one thing. The second thing is, also when my mind started to wander, I found that as I got more tired, I wanted more to share my own thoughts and ideas. I wanted to piggyback on what she was saying and add something or share something, which is, again, it goes, there's something very beautiful about our interconnectedness, but it's not good for empathic listening. So, we might all breathe the same air, but not during empathic listening. So, and when I was first learning how to do this, and it's something I've practiced, but when I was first doing it, I honestly was shocked at how much I wanted to speak or just smile or joke or do any little thing. I desperately wanted to be part of the conversation. And so one of the greatest skills, if you look at any sort of, business publication or career publication or the people that predict the future of work, all those guys, what is the thing that they say is the golden quality for the future, the 21st century workplace? It's empathy. So it's worth learning how to get good at it. So imagine what Leanne and I just did. Imagine doing that when you're having a fight with somebody. So instead of you're having a fight with your roommate or your parent or your partner or whatever, and you really just want to tell them how upset you are, imagine what would happen if you sat back and you took turns. So you learned reciprocity. So I learned to listen, pretend Leanne was telling me why she was upset and how I had disappointed her as a friend. And I just had to listen to it and really, really hear her, painful as that might be, and just reflect it back, see it, acknowledge it, walk in her shoes, be there with her every step of the way. That's what true empathy is when you, and this is making it an action, not just feeling it, you're actively choosing to be there. And so then once she says, I feel heard, then I say, okay, well, this is what was going on for me. And this is why I looked like I was being a bad friend and I didn't need to be. And I did though. And I've heard now what you said. And now I'm at a place where I can say, yeah, I acknowledge what I did and it breaks my heart and I'm sorry. Like imagine if our world leaders could talk to each other that way, how we could maybe move forward rather than just be in this constant sort of sling fast of hurtfulness.
Yes, indeed. It's important to remember that there's reciprocity in this empathy technique, and that once I say I feel heard, it becomes Jen's opportunity to be the speaker and I become the listener. And so there is that opportunity. And I think it's also important to notice, back to what you were saying originally, that the ACEs study was funded by Kaiser Permanente Medical Group here in the United States. And it had a very biomedical focus on it. And I think that's why some of the socio-cultural elements that you were talking about didn't get covered in it. But one of the beautiful things about research is that over time, we can build on it. And so I think with the current wave of awareness, we understand that some of those intersections like immigration status could indeed be a source of trauma. And we're talking about adult to child trauma and bullying. And certainly that type of trauma reflects an empathic failure, adults to children, but it also reflects the fact that multi-generational trauma does get passed down to children through DNA, through nurturing, through the environment, and through so much more. So there's a lot of complex pieces at play here, but the reason why we feel, I hope I can speak for both of us, for all of us, that empathy is important, especially in sports, is because there's a degree of listening, attention, focus that is required in the athletic arena. And so athletes need to be able to show that they have heard what their coaches are telling them, and coaches need to hear and demonstrate that they have listened carefully to what other people are telling them. And so just like you were wondering how empathy, empathic listening and speaking could affect our world through our leadership, I imagine that empathic listening and speaking could perhaps reduce the level of abuse that is so prevalent in sports.
Absolutely. And also taking that idea of if a coach is role modeling empathy and teaching players about empathy, one of the strongest team dynamics is to have total empathy with one another. Because if you have huge empathy with each other, you never blame each other. You never fault one another for mistakes. You constantly show up in ways that surprise and surpass even your own self-expectations, because you're doing it for them. You're doing it for the team on such a deep level. And I mean, even imagine you're passing the ball. Well, if you have a strong empathic bond with another player, you know where they're going to be. You know what they intend, you know what they're thinking, and you know what they're feeling. And so that type of closeness, this is why it's so sought after in the work world, because if you've got a team of people working together, a corporate team, let's say, or a medical team, or a team of psychologists, and they know each other well, and they care about each other, and they know how to communicate on that level, it's unstoppable. And same thing with athletic performance, of course, in teams.
So you're saying that empathy promotes cohesion in teams?
Yes, if I was very articulate and I could say things succinctly, I would have said it like that. Unfortunately, as my kids say, you don't have to go on and on.
We have one question, and I was planning on, we're just past the halfway mark now. We're actually like 10 minutes past. So I was thinking of maybe launching a poll to see if people wanted to take a break now or in 15 minutes. The question is, are there any strategies you can do by yourself that can help build your empathetic listening endurance?
Practice.
Oh yeah.
Want me to restate the question, Jen?
Well, no, now that Leanne answered, I know what the question was, and I'd love to say something about that. One of the things that we tend to forget, we think, especially athletes, you think about exercising your body all the time. And you think about, and like going back to what Jameson was saying about, we want instant results, but as athletes in particular, it's hard work. You're in the gym, you're doing the work, and you're super disciplined about it. You can take that same approach to something like empathy, because another great way to think about the brain, and we forget about our brains all the time because we can't see them, and we're quite primitive that way. If we can't see something, we tend to ignore it. So we can see our bodies, and so we put a huge amount of attention on them. You can do the same thing with your brain. Your brain is like a muscle. So the more you work on the neural networks in your brain, so let's say you're working the neural network for empathy by, as Leanne says, you have to practice it. Self-compassion, you got to practice it. Not having negative self-talk, you have to practice that. And the more you practice it, the more you myelinate the neural network. And myelin is seen in talent hotbeds in athleticism as it's just a miraculous, wonderful, it's like a fertilizer in a sense. It's essentially, it's an insulator that goes over a neural network. And if you practice something a lot, that neural network gets myelinated. So let's pretend I am practicing the neural network for bullying every single day in the locker room, any chance I get on the field. I go home and I bully my family, anyone who's smaller or weaker than me, symbolically or figuratively or whatever. I am actually myelinating the neural network for bullying, and it becomes normalized to me, and it becomes a default mechanism. In fact, I get to a point where I can't stop doing it because my brain is so primed for this type of behavior because I practice it day in, day out. You look at some of the very high level abusers that end up in the media and scandals and jail and the whole shebang. Those people have been doing that same behavior, literally like a broken record, like a script, that they are compelled to do the same gestures, wear the same clothes, go to the same place. It's kind of shocking. They're like caricatures of human beings. They're no longer making clear, independent, healthy decisions based on individual relationships at all. So that is an example of such a highly myelinated brain in a negative sense, but you can do it differently and be anything you want by practicing how you want your brain to be. This is why you can optimize performance on a brain level in powerful ways by practicing. Sorry, ranting again. Oh my gosh. Could you say that, Leanne, just in a one-liner? Practice. That's all.
Neurons that wire together, fire together. No, that fire together, wire together. That's what you were saying.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And can I just have, since we're all Canadians here, can I not just tell you all that is from a Canadian psychologist, Donald Hebb. He is the one that taught the world that neurons, brain cells that fire together. In other words, you repeatedly do it, they wire together. In other words, that becomes a part of your brain architecture. Canadian.
Yeah. My alma mater. He was a professor when I was at McGill.
Oh, wow. That's even
Yeah.
better. Yeah.
I know, right?
He's such an amazing, like, what an amazing man, brain,
Yeah.
amazing person. Okay, so Jameson and Leanne and I were just having a fast talk about sort of what will we do for the last, half an hour or so. And I just wanted to start out by talking about, we talked about how when compassion breaks down, like how does that happen? And I want to talk a little bit about how does it empathy break down? And there's really interesting research that shows that we tend to be more empathic. And this actually goes back to something that Leanne talked about at the beginning, but I think it's worth repeating, and it's worth repeating in the empathy context. So the research shows that we're more empathic to people that are like us. So Leanne and I would be empathic to each other because we're both people that are researchers, and we both try and help people. And we're very interested and passionate about education, and we're deeply concerned about trauma. So we would share that, and I'd have lots of empathy for Leanne. But let's pretend on our talk today, we had a woman who had 15 cats in her house, and she believed in animal rights. And the next thing you know, in my brain, I'm calling her the cat lady. I'm not really trying too hard to remember her name. And I've got a lot of judgments happening. I think she's a little bit crazy. I think she doesn't get along with other people. That's why she has to spend time with animals. Like, imagine the kinds of things that my brain, my history might start generating. So one of the exercises in a, if we have an athlete's toolbox, let's say, or a coach's toolbox, what we want to do is really push ourselves. If we want to get good at empathy, we need to push ourselves that extra mile to walk in the shoes of people who are very different from us. That's where you're really working the muscle of myelination. You're really working the muscle of empathy, and you're myelinating a truly deep neural network for having empathy for everybody, not just for people that are in your tribe or in your in-group. You are extending that and really going that extra mile for those that aren't. And that's powerful, and it can make a huge difference to you as well as to everyone that you encounter.
So you're talking about the difference between in-group empathy and empathy for people in the out-group, not included in one's in-group. You're also talking about how the brain likes to quickly sort people, others, unknown others, into categories really quickly. And so those two tendencies tend to result in implicit bias being carried out, and stereotyping, bias, discrimination, marginalization, inequities happen as a result of this type of thinking. In Buddhist psychology, and essentially what Buddhist psychology is, it's the areas that psychology has not been able to answer in the last 100 years, let's say, have been answered by some Buddhist practices in the last 20 years. And then there's evidence to show the worthiness of these types of practices. And so one of the ideas that Buddhist psychology has inherited from the Buddha is the idea of the beginner's mind. And so if we can come to every situation, every new person, every new encounter with an old person with a beginner's mind, as if you know nothing at all, that is the disposition that also melts implicit bias, discrimination, ingrained supremacies, for example, and allows a person to encounter the present moment and other people they're with open, balanced awareness, and then perhaps have a moment to notice when their bias creeps up and they're starting to be judgmental about the image of cat ladies, who are very nice, by the way.
Exactly. No, that is, I wrote that all down actually, because it's not something I know anything about, and I love it. I love that idea, and it's something I would like to cultivate in myself, that beginner's mindset. I think at one point when we were talking, I was thinking of the word curiosity, like how
yes.
Things change when we become curious. And yeah, it's a quality, actually. I hate to be personal, Jameson, but Jameson's mother, it's one of her key qualities. She's a curious person, and she brings that to all her encounters, and it's why she's so lovely. Something I wanted to talk about, building on, Leanne, this idea of the in-group and out-group, that I think is worth talking about in our pandemic times, is that the pandemic has forced us some of us into groups that are our household, that are our apartment building, our family, let's say, our roommates, who maybe we ended up just being roommates with them for convenience, whatever. And it's kept us away from our in-group, such as our team, or the coach-athlete relationship, or the professor-student relationship, or your friends. And that has been incredibly difficult. And all of us just talk about needing self-compassion. People who don't feel accepted, perhaps, in the physical structures in which they have to live. That isn't their community. It's not their people. And they had to be separated because of the pandemic. You got to give yourself a lot of just self-care around that, I think, because that's been really hard. And just one other aspect to add to that for anyone who's young on the call. Lots of people don't know that adolescent brain development, we tend to think of adolescence as the teen years, but when it comes to brain development, it actually goes to 25, maybe 26 even. From 13 to 26, your brain is not mature. It's not fully adult in the sense that you are well integrated. Your emotional brain is very well integrated with your prefrontal cortex, or your rational brain, the part of your brain that's very reasonable. It's not emotional. It thinks about the consequences. It's quite cautious. It's a problem-solving part of you. Whereas your emotional brain is on fire during adolescence, and that's why everything's so vivid. That's why you burst into tears. That's why you lose your temper and surprise yourself. It's why you do all kinds of your risk taking, your reward seeking. And your brain is primed for this during adolescence, because it was the way that evolution would get you to leave the safety of the cave, the family tribe, all of that. You'd have to march out and go find yourself a mate, essentially, out into the wilderness, out into the Serengeti. You'd have to go around corners. You'd have to risk predators. And so it gave you lots of rewards for that. Well, in a 21st century context, that can be a bit of a danger, really, to you. It's a danger, and your brain never anticipated you'd be driving a car, for example. So risk taking and reward seeking and having lots of your attention drawn to your peers in a car is a dangerous thing. So you have to manage your developing brain at that time. But the reason I say all this is just for you to understand that one of the primary things of the adolescent brain is peer relationships. And during the global pandemic, peer relationships got shut down in a big, huge way. Social media I'm not really, Leanne, you might be able to speak to this. I'm not sure why Zoom does not do it for us, but it doesn't. We all miss human interaction in a massive way. So being separated from your peers in that human interaction way, that's been hard on you too. And again, another opportunity for lots of self-compassion and healing around that.
Even just based off of Dr. Siegel's, what he said, he was like, I believe it shouldn't be physical or social distancing. It should be physical distancing and social connection through that. That brought to mind for me, like what I am hearing you say right now, which is the importance of that connection, and just trying to give myself space for that. Just kind of, yeah, so true.
So the question then is, how do developing adolescent brains and their bodies and the people that carry them around, how do they grow in a health and develop in a healthy way when there's a pandemic leading to more isolation? And I think that there are a lot of different elements at play here. So on the brain side, yes, there's a lot going on in the adolescent's brain up until the mid-20s, including a burst of connections being made in the brain, and then pruning, where the connections from early childhood that are no longer needed get pruned away, so to speak. So there's a lot that is happening during an adolescent's life. I do understand the value of young people connecting with their peers, adolescents and young adults as well, adults, senior citizens, animals. So there is a longing of those who are living to connect with others like them. One of the things that we were talking about on our break as we were pre-planning this segment is the LGBTQ youth and what it means to them, or the athletes and what it means to them to be locked down and away from their team for the athletes, or away from chosen family, kinfolk, friends that our LGBTQ youth might be choosing, where their families are rejecting them. So I'm disappointed and sad to say that, of course, there has been an increase in substance abuse, suicidality, abuse, intimate partner violence, child abuse. And as a result, it's my sense that forcing people to be with other people that they are not getting along with has not been healthy and wise. On the other hand, I think there's something in our culture that has been maladaptive in the way we have been training and educating youth. And so the developmental challenge of young adults is to launch from the family of origin and cleave to, if not a mate, a group, an ideology, something that gives them identity outside the family of origin. The pandemic has just delayed that. It doesn't mean that youth are not going to launch and separate and find. It's just delayed. And because we have seen an overarching and prevalent failure to launch of our young adult children in this culture, I'm going to advocate and say, despite the barriers, the drawbacks, and the negative consequences that I listed earlier, the pandemic may serve a decent purpose in having people re-examine themselves in their lives, which is a necessary part of adolescence launching into adulthood. So let's just call this an unexpected pause, but it's not the end. This is not where it all ends, and that we will see launching and togetherness all over again. And we will still see suicidality, substance abuse, intimate partner violence, and child abuse. Those things will all continue beyond the pandemic. So it's a bit of a complicated time, and we're going to make our way through it one way or another.
Yeah, I love the idea of let's take the pandemic and make it a post-traumatic growth opportunity, as opposed to just focusing always on the trauma. The world, our lives are full of big T traumas and little t traumas. And it's Jameson, back to, what we were trying to put together at the beginning. It's all about mindset. It's how you respond, because you actually can, talk about visualization. You can think about that writ large as you can visualize and imagine and set forth on what you want your life to be like. No one can tell you who you are, what your potential is. And you have the choice every single time not to listen. You can listen to the still quiet voice within, the voice of knowing. You can listen to negative self-talk. You can listen to friends who love you, family who loves you, coach who loves you. It's up to you. It's always a choice. And every single time you make a choice, your brain changes in response. Just like when you make a choice to go to the gym, your body changes in response. It gets strong. It gets more flexible, and it gets more resilient. So does your brain. Every single time you make those kinds of harder choices, perhaps, because our brain is geared towards inertia, actually. And this, again, is grounded in the research. It's really hard to make a change, but once you do, your brain starts rolling in that direction. And we all have for me, it takes about 6 months. I don't know why I'm slow on it. Some people, it can be more like 6 weeks. They can make that kind of brain change. I'm slower.
Indeed, there's some volition in each one of us and some capacity to make decisions, but I also want to bring up people of color, biracial people, Indigenous people. They may not have the same same opportunity to make choices that just enable their lives like this. And so coming out of the pandemic as a post-traumatic growth is certainly idealistic. And I think there's definitely opportunities, but we're all going to come out of it differently. And in the United States, for example, our families of color, Latinx families, have been deeply, deeply affected by COVID and by racism. And those are having some permanent effects, that changing minds and making decisions about how to proceed with one's life may not be adequate. So I just want to add, for the purpose of our workshop, that people that work with athletes, or if you're an athlete yourself, just please be aware of the biracial, Indigenous, and people of color around you, and know that to be truly empathic is to understand that their experience might be vastly different than yours. Or if you belong to that group, giving kindness to yourself and finding people that can support you as having the experience that you're having.
Yeah, I honestly think that's so important. I mean, at the start of I'd say last May, when the Black Lives Matter movement started, I caught myself kind of shifting in the direction of wanting some sort of change, and people posting black squares and stuff like that on their social media in support of Black people and people of color and Indigenous people. And it's interesting to see how that's shifted. I realized in the last couple of months, with people who have said at the start that they're in allyship, or they're in support and what that looks like for different people, because certain people have kind of withdrawn themselves from the conversation, even in just like trying to start conversations with people about it. And certain people are very willing to continue to engage in it. And yeah, that's kind of like, I'm appreciating that you said that. And I think that's an area for me that I like to continue to focus on.
Yeah. Allyship looks different in different situations, just like discrimination presents itself, sometimes covertly, sometimes overtly. And so just remembering to be as open and balanced, aware, curious, and kind with people and ourselves is how we make it through these times.
Yeah, just listening to that made me think of, it's interesting, like if we think about empathy, you know, this idea of #MeToo. So being a woman prior to Black Lives Matter and COVID, that was kind of a dominant thing, like, oh, I'm a victim too. And everybody kind of going like, is it actually possible that our workplace is this riddled with sexual harassment? Like, really? You know, it was kind of a shocking thing. Like, it's been quite shocking, Black Lives Matter, I think, for many of us, thinking that, oh, civil rights has happened and everything's fair and it's equal and so on, and realizing it's just unbelievable, continuing like soul destroying racism, like life destroying racism. And you know, what would happen if, like, think about your mindset. So #MeToo, yes, I'm a victim, versus #YouToo. What's going on for you? Where have you been victimized? How is that maybe holding you back? How can I be with you on that journey? You know, that's more this idea of being an ally. So that, and what I would think on one level, and maybe it's process, Leanne, you could maybe weigh in on this with your kind of knowledge, but I'm thinking process, like Me Too is, I have to acknowledge, yeah, I've been victimized, and that's a self-compassion piece. I don't have to pretend I'm a hero. I don't have to always stand up for everyone else. I can go, yeah, I got hurt. I got really badly hurt. I see it, I acknowledge it, but now I make it empathic, like I belong to a community, #MeToo, but I also want to know about you, #YouToo. What is it like to have been Indigenous and sexually harassed? You know what I mean?
These different movements has shown us the degree of discrimination, oppression, and marginalization that these particular communities have actually been telling us about for hundreds of years. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw showed us about intersectionality way before these movements came to light. So they're just revealing, you know, just as social media and video cameras on cell phones in the pocket have revealed for us the depth and level of racism, discrimination, marginalization. And it isn't just ethnicity, skin color, it is gender. And it isn't just sexism against women, but it's gender discrimination for people who are gender expansive, for example, in their identifications. And so I just want to speak, it's really interesting. We're all Canadians, but I live in the United States now for at least 25 years. And my research on education showed me that there's a massive intersection between education and trauma. And I discovered that educational trauma is the pervasive and prevalent perpetuation of harm in schools. It's unintentional. Nobody intends to do this, but it's actually very systematized. And the more I did my research, the more I realized that it was basically because I came from outside of the country that I was able to see it with this glaring relief that wasn't evident to people living in it. And that's the idea that white supremacy has infiltrated so many of the institutions in the United States, unlike in Canada, for example. This is not North American. It certainly bleeds across the continent, but this is actually uniquely American. And that's the idea that that slavery never ended here. At all. And so people get inculcated into white supremacy in schools here in the United States. And there is a lot of benefit to remaining willfully ignorant and to residing in white ignorance, because it's where, for example, my privilege lies. And so for me to unpack my privilege would be disadvantageous to me. So I'm trying to show here that there are a lot of ways in which movements have revealed to us the things that have been long in existence, and that these trends are perpetuated through generations by schools via euphemized curricula, terms, practices. And essentially we bully children into becoming other bullies. And that's what our schools are like. And athletics is an example of educational trauma when it happens in the name of any school, anywhere. There's tremendous abuses. Anyways, I digress there wildly.
No. It's not in Canada. It's maybe not to the same degree, but it's definitely alive and well. It's amazing, actually. It's what I found fascinating in my research, and I think it's interesting for the athletes that are in this workshop with us. What I finally kind of came to realize, and I sort of had to be hit over the head with it, was that we say on the one hand, we have zero tolerance for bullying. We don't tolerate abuse. We will instantly step in and stop it. None of us are bystanders, not even our children. We teach our children, don't be bystanders. That's all Bolshevik, absolute Bolshevik. It's not true. We actually are a society where our systems are very firmly in place to protect perpetrators. They re-victimize very quickly, and they do everything in their power to protect the perpetrator. And my theory is, and I float it with you today, my theory is, it goes back to what we talked about before, that adults have gotten into an in-group together. They have lots of privilege, lots of power, lots of finance, and they all are alike. And they have some kind of strange fear that if we somehow see children as our equals, and we grant them the same kinds of respect and power and civil rights and so on, then they will somehow usurp us. It's this very interesting phenomenon to me. So that's a bigger issue in question. But just to bring it back to athletics in a more specific way, what I found was we believe on a very deep level, athletics perpetuates this model a lot, that abuse is a necessary evil for greatness, that a team will only become great, an athlete will only win a championship, the coach will only be acknowledged as successful if significant abuse occurs. And they liken it to the military model. You have to break people down, these athletes, so you can build them back up in your image. That actually is pervasive still. And it shows up across the board in society in lots of different ways, but it's very dominant still in athletics, regardless of what we say.
Yeah. It seems to me that adults are threatened by children, as you were saying. I'm not sure there's a conscious fear of usurpment, but there's an unconscious awareness that the vulnerability, helplessness, and powerlessness of children threatens the self-concept of adults. And so I think it's the vulnerability of children that adult bullies are the most threatened by. And you can see that fueling the model in athletics that you just described of breaking a child and rebuilding them in one's image is a way of disarming people of their inherent vulnerabilities and the inherent helplessness, dependency, and powerlessness that children have. As you know, most animals come out of the womb able to live independently and walk right away. What, humans hang on for 20 freaking years. We're not developed. We have like 20 more years of pregnancy outside the womb.
Sorry, just interjecting here. There's two questions in the comment section here. One is to ask if we're able to move to stress reduction tools if possible before the end of the workshop. And one question as well here saying, going back to the question of racism in Canada, is there anyone that is not white who can say if it is similar in the US? I mean, I am half white, and I cannot say what racism is like firsthand in the US. So I don't want to speak on an experience that I don't have per se. But I'm not sure if that answers the question or not.
Can you repeat the second question, please?
Yes. Going back to the question of the racism in Canada, is there anyone that is not white who can say if it is similar in the US?
So we're comparing racism in the US to racism in Canada and wondering if there's anyone who's not white who can comment on it. I'm not sure there are many comparisons of racism in different countries because it has different flavors depending on the cultures that live in that particular country. But there are a lot of people that are writing about racism in Canada, racism in the United States, and sharing their viewpoints. So they are widely available. I'm unaware of a comparison internationally.
There's a clarification on the question here too. It says clarification here in Canada. Is there anyone that is not white who can say if it is? Yeah.
There's a whole series that came out through Maclean's magazine that I think might be really interesting, where Afro-Canadians talked about the racism that they live with in Canada. And they were, all the ones that I read, and there's quite a large number of them, spoke to just how Canadian racism is different, as Leanne says, at the same time as it's profoundly similar in its in its approach and the belief system behind it and so on and so forth, and they live it. It's not like you cross the border and it's different. So I think that series was extremely well done, and you would find, the person asking the question would find that really interesting, helpful.
Yeah.
And
As far as,
oh yeah, do you want to, you go ahead. I've got a little thing to say, but you jump in.
I was going to change the topic.
Oh.
Move to question number 1 and move along from that one, because it's predominantly white panel here. I think the questioner appropriately is indicating that we don't have authority in our space right now. And I don't want to out anybody who might be present in the audience at this moment, but certainly if you feel like commenting and you're representative of Canadian racism in some way, please speak up. We want to hear from you. At the same time, I feel that we recognize that we are ill-equipped to answer that question.
Totally.
We could even post resources afterward of where, Jen, where you suggested, and yeah.
Okay.
If I could close actually really quick, just an observation. I could say that from personal experience, I have experienced racism in Canada. Recently, I've had a couple experiences, but I'm not Black and I'm not Indigenous. So I believe that there's more intersections that layer on top of being Black or Indigenous in this country. So I can't speak to those.
Yeah. Thank you, Jameson.
Thank you.
So to the first question about tools for resilience, if you'll notice in the beginning, I led a brief meditation, and that's something that is freely available to you at any time. And it's associated with the decrease in anxiety, stress, increased in resilience, coping ability, all the things that you're looking for. There are hundreds, thousands of meditation practices, mindful awareness practices, both informal and formal. And so anytime that you connect with your breath, and exhale forcefully, like making a Darth Vader's breath, for example, you're releasing stress. Any kind of activity that puts you in your body, making contact with your body, remembering that you are a fully embodied person, not just the extension of your thoughts into the interwebs, but you are a body. So sports, exercise, yoga, running, walking, hiking in nature, especially swimming in nature, especially these types of activities, they're not just for health and well-being, but the closer you can get to nature when you're doing these embodied practices, the more bang you're going to get for your time and for your buck. There are lots more practices that I have available in my publications. There was a question before we began this about how one would use self-compassion for anxiety. So let's talk now about a few tips for using self-compassion and empathy for anxiety and stress reduction, because anxiety and stress tend to be used synonymously in a lot of places, and resilience is synonymous with coping ability, being able to bounce back, being able to sustain the weight of stress and pressure without kind of cracking or showing that it's affecting you. So beyond breath meditations, beyond body meditations, for example, there's the self-kindness. So here's the thing, a kind approach to yourself around being stressed and anxious is to say, at some point in time, somebody else has been anxious like me. maybe even now, and certainly in the future, somebody else will be anxious and stressed like me. And that kind of positive self-talk, gentle and reassuring, tells a person that they are not alone, and it invokes many of the different components of self-compassion. But wait, there's more. If you were to Google a TED Talk by Kelly McGonigal on the upside of stress, I forgot the title of the TED Talk, but her book is The Upside of Stress. And in it, she describes in a very brief 18 minutes how stress could be good for you because it promotes connection with other people. It stimulates certain chemicals, hormones in the brain, for example, and it has a positive effect on healing and well-being. So stress doesn't have to destroy you, but it will if you believe it does. And Kelly's research shows us that it's the way we look at stress, it's the way we look at pressure and anxiety that can be really harmful. And so when I was anticipating our time together today, I was a little bit nervous, which is highly unusual. And I told myself, I reminded myself of Kelly McGonigal's talk in her book. And I thought, I must be leveling up to have this beautiful day with Dr. Jen and Jameson. And so the nervousness that I was feeling was just my body getting ready. It was pre-work, right? It was that revving of my engines and getting into the mode and mood of everything. And so actually nervousness, excitement, anxiety, they all feel the same way. And so I might not have been nervous at all. I was just super excited. And you see how the whole tone just changes? Mm-hmm. And it's no longer a pathology of anxiety and nervousness and inability to cope, but it's a thrill of being alive and the invigoration and vitality and vibrancy of what it means to be human. And there I just gave you a story to tell yourself the next time you feel stressed and anxious. And that's a tool. And there's so many more.
Yeah, I highly recommend actually, if for anybody interested in, what are the tools, it's over 100. It's like 103 or something, isn't it, Leanne? In the Self-Compassion for Teens, which might as well, Self-Compassion for Teens for anybody else. 129. It's 129 exercises. So when you're stuck, you just go to the self-compassion book and you actually put something into practice. So
there's a whole section on bullying that honors all of Dr. Jen's work. So highly recommend.
On that note, I just want to say one more thing that was, I don't know what it is about me, but I somehow need it doubly explained. So I'm going to double explain something for you. It's like mansplaining, but I'm not a man. So one of the things that helps me understand why mindfulness is important, I think the tendency of people is to think it's an ancient practice and it's calming and so on. From a brain point of view, what's so interesting is what you're saying to your brain is you're telling your brain that you're safe, essentially. When you start to breathe slowly, your brain doesn't think there's any predators around. It doesn't think you're going to fall off a cliff. It thinks that you actually are sitting in the cave with your favorite people, roasting reptiles over the open fire. And so it calms down, it relaxes, and it stops pumping up cortisol. So what happens is in our stressed out 21st century world, going back to what Leanne was doing, talking about how incredibly fast everything has to be, and we put that kind of pressure on ourselves, we have a tendency to ramp up our cortisol way too often. And this is it's a corrosive stress hormone. In small doses, in the Kelly McGonigal way, it's fabulous. It's good for you. It's what challenges you and makes you do things and gets excited. But unfortunately for us, we've gotten into a kind of societal mode where we pump it up and we think that it's normal to feel this heightened, like high vibration stress all the time, and it's really bad for your brain. So it's in your power to do what Leanne says, which is to calm yourself down. How do you calm yourself down and tell your brain that you're okay? Because it can't tell the difference between a predator and a mean text from somebody. It can't tell the difference. To them, they're both saber-toothed tigers, and the brain primes you to run. It's evolutionary. So what you need to do is say to your brain all the time, take charge of it and go, you're fine. You got this. I'm breathing deeply because this is really safe. I'm comfortable. I'm happy. The cortisol goes off and you start to turn on things that are healing and healthy. Same thing, going back to what Leanne said about exercise. The second you exercise, your cortisol goes down, your testosterone and your serotonin and your dopamine goes up. So it's like a bathing, healthy thing for your brain. So it's up to you. Your mind is always in control. You always make that decision. Yet you have challenges from intersectionality of all the things you've had to deal with.
Yes, indeed, the practice of focusing your attention on your breath can bring about patterns within the brain that are calmer and more resilient to stress. But I want to add one caveat, which is that some people, most people aren't able to establish a calm and serene space in the meditation practice. And so the goal is not to experience that calm, peaceful, slow breathing. Rather, the goal in meditation is just to pay attention to breath. And the breath might be deep, it might be shallow, it might be rapid, it might be slow, it might be relaxed, it might be frenetic. And the idea is to encounter it in whatever state it's in. Encounter yourself, your mind and your brain and your body. And the more we repeat that encounter, the more resilient we become with it. Because much of our culture teaches us to flee from whatever we're feeling, experiencing, or thinking with substances, activities, and people, for example. And meditation forces us to confront it. So it's important to know that the meditation experience is not necessarily one of peace and zen. It actually requires a lot of self-discipline. And for people who've been traumatized, it can be a terrible place, a very dangerous one, actually. So caveats.
Yes. Yes, yes, and yes.
It doesn't look like we have comments in the chat. We have one comment that says, quote, "I find that worry is just undernourished enthusiasm." That's a quote from Schitt's Creek, the TV show. And we also have a comment saying that this whole workshop has been wonderful, but the last 10 minutes has been life-changing. So
thank you. I'm glad you've been enjoying this and appreciate the favorable feedback. I'm going to add another funny one to that Schitt's Creek quote. People go around with two prominent thoughts. One is something's wrong, and the other is something's wrong with me. But I have news for you. You don't have to believe either of those things. So just because your brain kicks into gear some cortisol or something or other, doesn't mean you have to run with that tiger. Just settle down. Don't believe everything you think.
Exactly.
That's great. Well, we're at the 6 p.m. mark. So we can, if you both would are comfortable with closing up shop, I guess, or if you have any more comments, then.
Jen, you just wanted to talk about some brain training, and we needed to also talk about how to train youth. And I think that's a perfect closing up. So just mention that, and then we can wrap.
Very good point. Okay, this is a 30-second thing. I recently, in my quest to find out how to heal brains, met Dr. Michael Merzenich, who is the neuroscientist that Jameson spoke about. So this is a perfect bookend to our talk. So Dr. Michael Merzenich, for anybody who wants to work on their brain, and you can work on your brain because you're worried about stress. You can work on your brain because you're worried about anxiety. You can work on it because of depression. You can work on it because you want a competitive edge as an athlete. Some of the top athletes in the world, in the professional sport world, use Dr. Merzenich's brain training because it so enhances their performance. Like Tom Brady, who, as you might all know, just won the Super Bowl for his team and is considered one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. And yet you wonder, how is it possible that he's performing like a 20-year-old when he's 43? He's dedicated to Dr. Michael Merzenich's brain training. And Dr. Michael Merzenich has made it super cheap. It's like $8 a month or something. And it's gamification. And it's like going to the gym, but you go to the gym for your brain. And it's at BrainHQ.com. BrainHQ.com, you sign up and you 3-4 times a week for half an hour, you have your little virtual personal trainer. I think her name is Daily Spark. And she puts you through your paces, peripheral vision, focus, that all the time that you strengthen these neural networks, you don't leave room in your brain for other neural networks that aren't serving you as well. They're not giving you Leon grade peak performance. They're actually holding you back. You can, going back to what she said about pruning, you can replace those negative neural networks by not leaving enough room for them, by working really hard, like working out the positive ones, because the brain has limited cortical real estate. It doesn't have enough room for the negative and the positive. You put your work into the positive, this withers away, you can prune it. So that's my last tool. And I'm also happy, anybody have follow-up from this or want to talk or just have some extra questions, I'm happy to have you email me. I'm happy to talk to you.
That's great. I've just put the links. Sorry, I've just put the links in the chat there. I just want to say that. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jameson. Thank you, Leanne.
Thank you, Jameson. Thank you, Jen, and to all the people who have joined us today. I send you off with love and peace, blessings. May your way always be lit with love and goodness.
Thank you very much.
I echo that succinctly.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Gray and Dr. Fraser both, and to everyone for joining us today. If for any reason you want to look back at the topics that we've covered today, as I said, this will be recorded and it'll be edited and posted to YouTube by the end of this weekend. So you can go back to our Mindset Lab YouTube channel to check out if you want to revisit any of these strategies. And again, in the chat, I've put a couple of the resources that both Dr. Gray and Dr. Fraser have alluded to. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you, Dr. Fraser, and thank you, Dr. Gray, for joining us as well. I'm very, very appreciative of that.